Good morning, members. We now have the quorum at the scheduled time. And thank you for coming to this meeting for panel on development. Can we please invite the administration team into the room? We shall use the electronic voting and speaking system, and please choose on your assigned seat. First item, briefing by the Secretary for Development on the Chief Executive 2021 Policy Address. The paper is already set out on the agenda. And member, feel free to press the button if you would like to speak. Good morning, Secretary and his team. Well, there are various departments under Development Bureau. We have quite a big team from the administration today. The Bureau has prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and now can we have the Secretary to give us the opening remarks? Chairman and members, I shall give a brief introduction on the development-related initiatives on the policy address. Well, the starting point will be the Hong Kong 2030 Plus. Well, this is about the long-term vision for the spatial development framework. According to the eventual projection, the land shortfall to 2048 will be 3,000 hectares. Compared to the previous estimate of 1,200 hectares, this had risen substantially. And this is based on the observation for the task force on land supply as well as the public aspiration. How do we arrive at the 3,000 hectares? As for the land demand till 2048, altogether there will be 5,800 to 6,200 hectares. And taking into account the committed land supply, there are about 3,200 hectares. Therefore, we are 3,000 hectares short. However, we are able to secure enough land to plug this shortfall. So here are the 14 possible solutions spaced. Altogether, there will be 4,100 hectares. We see there's a need for some buffer space to build up our land bank. It's worth noting that the Kaohsiung artificial initiatives at the northern Metropolis can contribute 2,200 hectares. Altogether, they made up of about 70 to 80% of the total solutions of possible land supply. In the next decade, we identified enough land to build 330,000 public housing units. This is the second year that we're able to see the demand projected by the long-term housing supply. And this is actually exceed the estimated public housing demand of 301,000 units projected in the same period. For private housing land, in the next decade, we can secure 170 hectares of land for 100,000 private housing units. And we didn't include the Urban Renewal Authority projects and other private land development projects. For the medium and long term, well, assuming the domestic plot ratio of 4 to 6.5, we can provide about 0.4 million to 0.5 million public or private housing units in medium long term. That really stem from the Hongshou and NDA, as well as the Northern Metropolis and the Kaohsiung artificial islands. The Northern Metropolis development strategy is one of the cornerstone of this year's policy address. And altogether, we can provide 165,000 to 186,000 units that can build in the Northern Metropolis. And the supply of housing units can go up to 565,000 to 686,000 units in the period of the 10 to 15 years after 2031. And for the adjoining projects, for example, the NT North, that's how we would incorporate that. If there are no study running, let's say in the Laofaoshan Qinpei Cherry area, the Hongshui Chiu Hachin study is completed and we will kickstart new projects. New shore reclamation. Next year, we hope to come to LegCo to secure the funding to kickstart the planning and engineering study for the Longkutan reclamation and replanning of the Chinmen West. For the 60 hectares for Mali reclamation, together with the relocation of the Shatin sewage treatment plant, altogether 88 hectares will remain reserved for INT development. For these two projects, we hope to come to secure funding from LegCo in the first half of 2022, and to start the reclamation on or before 2027. The green belts. The government conducted a two-phase review on green belt zones. About 1/3 of the site in question are green belts. There will be a third round of review where we review at about 300 hectares of green belt, which made up 2% of the total green belt zones. By mid-2022, we expect the completion of identifying promising sites for housing based on the data collected before embarking on further technical studies. On streamlining approval process, streamlining development control is also a concern area. Since 2018, after we launched the steering group, and now we launched streamlining measures on 9 development parameters. And over the past week, we included 1 additional development parameter. In the past, we mainly reviewed the administration procedures and focus on the departments under Development Bureau. And next, we shall focus on the developmental procedures as stipulated by the ordinances, for example, on urban planning, land resumption, environment impact assessment, and road works. We hope to come with a concrete proposal by the first half of next year and table an amendment bill within next year. One of the measures streamlined is the standard rates. While the pilot scheme for charging land premium at standard rates for industrial building redevelopment, while 6 months into launching, it is very well received by the sector. For the past 3 years, we have received 3 applications or reached an agreement. And within 6 months of the pilot scheme, 5 of the cases choose to assess the standard rates for premium assessment, and 4 of which already reached an agreement. And time-wise, the process is much expedited compared to conventional approach. And now we decided to expand it to in situ land exchange in new development areas. So by first quarter of next year, we will come up with the details. Expediting urban renewal. I would like to thank the URA, which completed the district study for Yau Ma Tei and Mong Kok, which proposed some innovative planning tools, and for the new projects, to allow the transfer of plot ratio and street consolidation. So by 2022, we can promulgate guidelines and kickstart the first batch of zoning amendments to allow the URA to try out the new planning tools. I must stress that these planning tools not just apply to URA projects, it should also apply to private redevelopments. We invited the URA based on the experience of the district study for Yamate and Mongkok to kickstart the planning for Chunwan and Samshui Po. And on the reviewing the compulsory sale threshold, we'll consider how do we suitably lowering the compulsory sale threshold to expedite development of old and dilapidated buildings. We hope to expedite the redevelopment of older buildings. We will try to strike a balance between expediting urban renewals while protecting the right of owners holding private properties, particularly the interests of minority owners. And finally, on capital works. The government will continue investing in infrastructure to enhance people's living quality and supporting society's economy and long-term development, as well as uplift Hong Kong's competitiveness. In this financial year, I thank the Finance Committee and LegCo. And this panel, the approved funding for public works project reached a record of $230 billion. We expect the government's annual budget on capital works will exceed $100 billion per year in the coming years. And that's the end of my introduction. I thank the Secretary for the opening remarks. And let me read out the list of members who would like to speak. Mr. Edward Lau, Mr. Vincent Chang, Mr. Leung Chi Chang, Mr. Frankie Yik, Mr. Ma Fong Kwok, and myself, and finally, Mr. Wilson Orr. And members who would like to speak, please press the button now. And now we have Mr. Tony Chia. 4 minutes per round. Mr. Edward Lau, Deputy Chairman. So my question is on the Northern Metropolis, as this is one of the key important developments. If we take 20 years and based on existing ordinances, they're probably a bit optimistic. 20 years is still a long time. We hope to expedite the process, for example, through legislative amendment and procedure streamlining. May I ask the Secretary, which are the key procedures that you start reviewing, and what kind of effect will this review bring? In order to compress the construction program, so some of the announced initiatives will they be incorporated into the current studies? For example, the Sha Tin Technopole incorporated into the 24-month Sha Tin Lok Ma Chau node study, for the Low South Station and Mount Kam Chau be incorporated into the 36 months New Town study, so that the study who already started can be expedited. Well, the NT-North New Town study and the Northern Metropolis strategy seems to be quite similar. I wonder, can you change the name to Taku Lang NDA to differentiate the two? That's my second question. And third question, when launching this Northern Metropolis program, there will be a lot of land resumption involved. Well, these areas within the Northern Metropolis, we have the NDA and the public housing projects. Well, they're probably offering grade A or grade B rates. With the Metropolis strategy announced, I wonder if you can align the compensation, whether you're part of the NDA or for public housing within the Northern Metropolis area, they should offer an aligned grade A rates. And if we need to involve a massive land resumption, would you consider issuing land bonds to take a dual track approach? Without offering compensation, you can also issue land bonds. Mr. Lau asked a total of 5 questions. If some of the areas within Northern Metropolis are joined to the study areas, let's say the Châtillon Marchot and Technopole, like Mr. Lau said, we will adjust the study parameters in order to let the current study to cover these new areas. That may not be possible in all cases. Take Macholong, for example. For the Kutulong North area has already completed, and the La Foshan and Pak Nai areas. And basically, the Hong Shui Q HAQ study had already been completed, and therefore we need to launch new ones. In terms of the naming, I agree with Mr. Lau. Before the Metropolis, we talk about the NT North NDA, or part of it will be the NT North New Town. This may sound confusing now. Therefore, we can consider we're working on the name. However, we may not adopt the name as suggested by Mr. Lau.
And now turn to the land issues. Currently, we will resort to Class A in relation to compensation for resumption of land. For the Northern Metropolis, as the C has said, in terms of a concept, we aren't talking about a new development area or administrative district. So I don't think we can adopt Mr. Lau's proposal. Bonds. Now, for a large project, like in the case of the artificial islands in Kaoyizhou or the Northern Metropolis, the administration has already said that where the case is appropriate, this will be considered. But probably it may not be actually along the same line as suggested by Mr. Lau. And then for streamlining the development controls, I would like to defer to the PS, Ms. Ling. Well, as the Secretary has said, early next year, we would like to come back to the LegCo for the discussion. Well, as far as the approach is concerned, what we're actually talking about is to compact the time for statutory processes, and we'd like to have a number of steps being done in parallel. And then for some outdated or unreasonable arrangements, they've been bordering the landowners. And then, in fact, when it comes to a statutory plan, an argument pertaining to one point may hold up the entire plan. And then, among different pieces of legislation, we may have repetitive procedures among them. So we just wonder if we can have the following. Say, if objection or similar, and objections dealt with under one piece of legislation should be deemed to have been dealt with under other pieces of legislation as well, if the viewpoints are the same. Next, Mr. Vincent Zhang. I would like to ask a question concerning urban renewal. I'm a non-executive director on the board of the URA. We're grateful to the Secretary for taking on board our views. That is, there will be a district planning study for Sam Shui Po and Chin Huan. It is necessary for Kim Sin Lane. Well, in fact, the renewal project is popular among the residents. The current living conditions are poor. So for the district planning studies, we hope that this can be done as early as possible, as we have already got experience from Yau Ma Tei and Mong Kok. So perhaps we can start the planning study for Chin Wan and Sam Shui Po. Another point is about the reviewing the compulsory sale thresholds. Like in the case of Yau Ma Tei and Mong Kok planning study, we welcome the proposal. We've got many buildings with an age of more than 50 years, and the conditions are really bad. Now, I understand that you have to spend a year or more to deal with the review. I just wonder if you can sort of expedite the process, like in the case of the planning study for Yau Ma Tei and Mong Kok. For people living in Yau Mong and Sam Shui Po, many of the residents are grassroots residents or even living in subdivided units. In the case of Taiwan Side Estate, I think the redevelopment project is good. So please use that as a reference point so that you can deal with the well-being of the grassroots properly. A few questions here. I would like to thank Mr. Vincent Zhang for his support for a number of our policies. For Chun Wan and Samshui district studies, I think the URA is going to start that soon to be completed in 2 years' time. For the compulsory sale thresholds, it was our plan to use 12 to 18 months to consult the community. It seems that there's a voice that we should expedite the process. We can consider that favorably. If there is a call for that, we are happy to shorten the time needed. And then for subdivided units, yes, the Transport and Housing Bureau has done a lot to address the issue. On our side, wherever and whenever possible, say, for example, we would like to see if we can have reciting housing resources, like for projects under URA. In the case of Kaita, we do have such an arrangement. This will be given more consideration in the future. Any other follow-up questions? No? Thank you. Next, Mr. Leng Chi-Chen. Thank you, Chair. For this policy address, indeed, many people think that the vision is a very long-term and ambitious. Now, the THB told us that it would take 20 years before we could cut the waiting time for public housing back to 3 years. This is disappointing. Mr. Wang, you are sort of providing the resources for the THB. For Malushui reclamation, according to your PowerPoint, it appears to me that you may not get the support of residents in Malushui. After reclamation, upon reclamation, the water body would become a narrow river. So I just wonder if near-shore reclamation is indeed something people would welcome. I think you have given up on the idea of the so-called peripheral area of the country parks as to the boosting of land supply. So please justify the choice. And then for the Northern Metropolis, it is going to cover a huge area, and then covering both the Northern District as well as Yunnan District. And then for Maipo Conservation Area, according to your plans, it is said that some of the wetland areas will allow for superstructure construction. In other words, the Ramsar sites will be expanded so as to compensate for that loss. Well, the government will look at the broad concepts, but then at the micro level, I'm afraid the citizens will be much affected. Now, those who will be caught by the Ramsar site expansion will be much affected in terms of their residence as well as the means of living. So for those who will become so therefore those who will be caught by the expansion, the Ramsar site expansion, are you going to offer compensation to them? I'd like to thank Mr. Leung for his questions. Three points here. Near-shore reclamation. There is an advantage. Usually, the water level is lower. And then in the case of Malushui, if I may share an observation with you, I think many years back, like in 2011, there was an exercise to look at over 40 sites, and then we chose the option of 5+1, one being the Khao Yi Chau artificial islands. 5 covers 5 areas, including Malushui. Now, there was a suggestion to start the study, but then it was met by objection, mainly on 2 points. First, traffic congestion, as there is a huge population. Second is about the public-private mix. There would be more support if more land would be dedicated to public housing. Now today, there will be 60 hectares of land to be produced. at Malushu, and then we are going to get another 28 hectares of land by relocating the Sha Tin sewage treatment center. Well, I think it's a matter of hoping that people can sort of get work, can get jobs, and then in fact the traffic flow will be in the opposite direction, since we're going to use it for innovation technology development. So the concerns will be different from the concerns a few years back. And then the public reaction may be different. In the case of Kaohsiung, I think the C has said it is a matter of making a decision, making a choice. I think first of all, we should look at the case of for the case of country parks, it is a matter of making a choice. And then we should start with a study on the green belts. 200 hectares of land zoned green belt will be examined. We'll try to see whether there will be sites suitable for high density development, that is mainly for public housing. So we believe that it's more appropriate to start with green belts than country park peripheral areas. For the conservation of wetland and fishing ponds, well, at the wetland areas, well, the Environment Bureau will take the lead in terms of the study. Your concerns will be referred to Mr. Wang Gamsing. I'm sure he will give full consideration to your concerns. Next, Mr. Frank Yik. Well, I think members present here would agree that there are lots of economic activities on the Brownside fields. Construction industry, logistics industry, transport industry, etc. are involved. For Hong Shui Kiu, I think we are going to have multi-story buildings to relocate the brownfield site operators. Resumption has started, but it seems that we don't know how the relocation is going to take shape. You may think that by offering compensation, people will be happy, but in fact, this is not the case. You can't wait for a few years before you resume your operation. You're not going to do any good to our economic development. So for new development areas, I think the government must make sure that there will be a seamless sort of arrangement before you start the actual land resumption. For the policy address, we have the 14th five-year plan as well as the GBA development. You talk a lot about innovation technology, but quite silent on logistics. Now, the administration or the CE said that modern logistics is also part of INT, but then we don't get any data, we don't get any figures, you don't even have a paragraph on that. It will be difficult for us to hold you down for your promise. So I hope that in future, as far as logistics is concerned, please provide more information concerning its development. And then at Mencam-to, we have this fresh food control point, and then we have a control point at Heng Yun Wai. It is said that at Heng Yun Wai, it is inadequate, and also there's a lack of manpower on the mainland. And so transboundary lorries have to wait a long time to have the cargo inspected. If all the fresh and live food items are to be relocated to Mencam-to or Heng Yun Wai, I want to know whether this will work. And then for boundary control points, we usually get the hardware without the software, and so we never get the CIQ in place in good time. But then at the same time, we don't have anything to coordinate with the mainland counterparts. Usually, we have to wait for a long time before we can have full operation of the CIQ facilities. Yes, it takes 8 years to build a road. It is impossible. We need to expedite the process. We welcome the development control measures. For the protection of harbor ordinance, I think you need to review it. You are just being overcautious, and as a result, we're prevented from taking forward a large number of projects. Thank you, Chair.
For the Hong Shui Chu Hill and Hatchin brownfield sites, and we're offering financial compensation. Well, for the multi-story brownfield or logistic buildings, they won't come until a few years' time. So we've been restricted by the reality. well, hopefully we can provide some logistic or brownfield sites, hopefully around in Mang Kam area, as very close to the BCP. At the Long Ku Chan, there will be some commercial or residential development, and hopefully we can provide some logistic lands there. If we can advance the timetable, that would at least address some of the Mr. Yek's concerns. For the protection of harbor ordinance, as stated in the policy address, and later on we shall start a public discussion on this. Just a few points to stress. First, from the administration point of view, we do not have any high-density residential development on the harbor front. Well, it's really aimed to address the accessibility as well to provide more public space. For the existing projects, for the Island Eastern Corridor Boardwalk, we already secured the funding. We're confident that it will be able to meet the requirements under the Protection of Harbor Ordinance. And in the Kayak runway, there will be a cycling and pedestrian bridge to Kwun Chong. We're also confident about securing the funding. And has the ordinance hampered our future developments on it? So far, we're not seen any. However, later on we shall start the discussion on anyway. For the fresh provisions clearance, I will convey your concern to the Food and Health Bureau. Just allow me to respond to the Secretary. You claim there are no case development held up by the Protection of Harbor Ordinance. And well, how do we allow effective disbursement of passengers from cruise ship to the urban area? Well, you not even dare to launch pontoons to pick up allowed the passengers to disembark. Sorry for the misunderstanding. Well, we actually need to look at how the POBH on the launching pontoons. Well, there are a lot of possibilities or options we want to consider. Mr. Ma Fung Kwok? Hong Kong suffers from acute land shortage. Besides housing, there are also a strong demand for other purposes. To develop a city, a lot of the infrastructure must be in place to meet the resident needs, for example, recreation facilities. For economic development, culture or sports or tourism are also key driving forces. The chief executive mentioned about turning Hong Kong into a culture hub for the East and West, and she might consider setting up a cultural and sports bureau, and also mentioned about making the sports sector into an industry. Well, to build Hong Kong into a vibrant metropolis or a charismatic city, there is still a lot of work to be done. With the West Kowloon Cultural District taking shape as well as the Kai-Tak Sports Park, well, these are proposed more than 2 decades ago and completed just recently. And there are also new demands that cropped up. Well, for the water bodies surrounding Hong Kong, how do we capitalize on them to develop water sports? From the government's paper and other documents, there isn't much mention on how do we provide supporting facilities. Let's say for 500,000 people or 700,000 people, how do you plan to meet their demands? And for future economic needs, how can you provide the land for these projects now that you are coming up with the Northern Metropolis? Well, let's say for the sports or yacht clubs, or kart racing or drones, these activities promise huge potential and could be developed provided with enough land, and also help to enhance our tourism potential. So how do you plan to considered the needs of these industries early. Well, for the reclamation that was say for a straight coastline as opposed for reserving capacity for water sports or recreation facilities, these two may lead to a different coastline. So how do you plan to work on that? Secretary, for 2030 plus, we're offering more the bigger picture on a spatial framework. Well, very often we focus on the public housing supply for the economy and how many million of floor space and employment opportunities we can provide. Mr. Ma cared about the provision of open space. In 2030 plus, we are enhancing the provision ratio. As for the specific projects, let's say for the sport policy, which Mr. Ma cares strongly about, let's say the Kai-Tak Sports Park. Well, that will fall under the Home Affairs Bureau, and I can't tell that whether there will be another new bureau set up in the future. Let's say someone proposed using some space for a facility. The planning department will help with the site search. And so where should it be located? For any suitable sites, then we will start the land and the town planning procedures. For 2030 plus, well, we're probably wouldn't go down as detailed on specific projects. Follow up? Take the HAB, for example, for their report which they prepared earlier. Even based on current planning ratios, we do have a severe lack of sports and recreation facilities. We have already a hard time catching up. Now that you have so many new land development initiatives, let's say the north of Metropolis as case in point, well, instead of playing catch up, you can actually able to meet the future demands. We see that the future economy shall rely heavily on tourism and culture and sports. Therefore, we should be more forward-looking. Well, currently we already have an acute shortage. Secretary definitely have noted this view. I agree with Mr. Ma. Well, looking at the shortfalls, well, we do have a shortage on sports facilities and the elderly facilities. That's why we've identified 4,100 hectares. We hope that the legislature can support the funding applications and to enable the provision of more land to meet different kind of needs. My turn now. This year's policy address is definitely more forward-looking and provide a blueprint for the future. Especially desirable, like the BPA have been lobbying for the anti-north development. The government managed to dispense with the old mindset, no longer see the anti-north as a buffer area, but rather a brand new metropolis. Hopefully that we can make anti-north as somewhere to live, to work, to travel, which was important for us to capitalize on the GBA development. On how do we benefit the populace in the short term, especially the housing? Well, there seems to be little mention of it. The public response to the policy address comes with some backlash. That's where seems there's not enough effort put into resolving the housing shortage. The government mentioned that identify 330 hectares for over 300,000 public housing. And the secretary had introduced in the presentation. And now we have 350 hectares for 330,000 public housing units, which exceeded the 10-year provision target. Well, the public's is not satisfied. How do we become more aggressive in providing more land? Now that we have this huge blueprint for the NT North and for the currently developing NDAs or those who started the engineering and planning study, I wonder if they could be expedited. Now that we have this blueprint for NT North for other areas, can you do more on the other areas? And how can we boost the target for the 10-year plan? If Mr. Tong had proposed the 85,000 units per year, the 40,000 units per year, it can be, should something to be looked about. For the living space per capita, the BPA proposed this 10-year housing program, hopefully to expand the capita per space for 160 square foot to about 200 square foot. I see that the Secretary have been quite aggressive in proposing to have average living space per person at 237 square feet. And for the Yao Mate and Mong Kong district study, it proposed 220 square meter, 22 square meter, or even 26 square meter. Well, I suppose they were more spacious for the average Hong Kong home. I suppose that in the short term, is it possible to reach 200 square foot? Do you see it as feasible, Secretary? So for this supply for public housing, we see a great boost in recent years. Secretary Frank Chan mentioned that at the start of this administration, for the 10-year target was just 230,000, and a few years on, and now that the target is now 330,000. Well, I'm always the first on the relay match by turning land into spade-ready ones and turn over to the housing bureau for housing. About 350 hectares, out of which 80 hectares of which will be handed over to the THB. That's why they managed to build over 100,000 public housing in the next 5 years. For 2023 to 2027, we're confident for the remaining 250 hectares, as the THB will come with their own land, we're able to turn it over to them to build over about 230,000 units. Well, I would see this is a threefold increase. We will continue to work hard. It's hard to make breakthrough changes. However, through concerted effort, let's say that we can advance the supply by just 1 year or even a few years' time, that will be a huge improvement. Speaking of the average living space per person, for public housing, Frank Chan had made it clear that in the short term we can't achieve it. Well, for the housing supply next 5 years, already started or about to start construction. If we keep providing land to the public housing and everything goes smooth, by the second 5-year cycle, we can be more ambitious. For the Kowee Chow Artificial Island, they're expected to provide 150,000 to 260,000. 70% of those will be public housing. I already instruct my colleagues to have bigger units in mind. That means more land to the THB, as they need to calculate the floor space required. In the short term, for private housing, well, some of the measures may help. Like I said, for the government land sale programs or the Lands Department land lease approval, well, we can stipulate the minimum floor space per unit. We have any new ideas, and we will communicate with LegCo and the stakeholders.
I've got other questions, but I'll wait for my second round. Next, Mr. Gibson. Oh, thank you, Chair. regarding the 6th policy address, there are 2 points that I want to take up with the Secretary. First of all, earlier on for the Hong Kong 2030 Plus, in its final report, it is said that the land demand has been revised upwards. Does it mean that you are also demanding and getting more land for housing? According to the long-term housing strategy, I want to know whether this is the final target. In this case, it means that we have to wait another 15 to 20 years to cut the waiting time down to 3 years. Is it because the supply has not been increased? I'm trying to read the Hong Kong 2030 Plus study, but I cannot make anything out of it. Now, I think you need to get the views from different walks of life. Now, many people have said that this policy address is visionary and strategic, and we are trying to ride on the advantage of developing the northern metropolis. But then there's a long-term development. It is not going to help with our imminent problems. We have a housing shortage. We have a shortage of housing land. We have got suggestions from all quarters, hoping that there would be more land to be produced. Now, what about the Kwai Chung container port? I think the utilization rate has come down. According to the figures available, there are 400 hectares of land, 7 times Tai Kung Shing, housing 400,000 people. That's the potential. So what is the future for the Kwai Chung container port? It is said that maybe we can go to Cheung Chau or Kwai Shan Island for our future land supply. But what about reprovisioning the Kwai Chung container port? I think it is well positioned and it is well served by a large number of transport networks. So what is the long-term development of that site? Within the task force on land supply, I think there was a thorough discussion. Members came up with different suggestions to improve upon the arrangements. There are 3 sites at the container terminal, but then I think we're wasting the land resources there. Secretary. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Let me first of all deal with Kwai Chung container terminal. Now, it comes under the jurisdiction of Mr. Frank Chan, THB. Yes, the total throughput has reduced, but then we have got peak seasons and non-peak seasons. So if you look at the container terminal operation, it is felt that there is a need to keep it there. As to the longer term, earlier on, when we looked at the 1,000 hectares of land for the artificial islands in the central waters, when we came here to get your funding approval, we also examined the feasibility of using Cheung Chau South as the relocation site for the terminal, for the container terminal. Now, back to Hong Kong 2030 Plus study, we have got 14 possible sites for long, medium-term land supply. Kwai Chung terminal is not being one of them. For the housing land identified in 2030 Plus, well, we do have an increase of housing land. A few years back, it is said that the shortage should be 230 hectares of land. Well, as of now, it has become 680 hectares. In the next 10 years, if we're able to build public housing, then it means that we can meet the LTHS demand. And in fact, we are able to provide all the land needed for housing in the next 5 years to meet the 10-year target. Mr. Tony Chair. Well, of course, we are all concerned about land and housing. For the policy address this year, I think we get a lot of proposals. Our attention is, of course, on the Northern Metropolis strategy. Well, according to that booklet, I think there are as many as 45 items in the action plan. Well, of course, the current term government has only got 8 months left, but I'm sure you will still work hard on a large number of projects. Let's try to boost the morale of the administration. They do have a lot on their plate. Chair, you mentioned the 10-year housing supply target. according to the policy address, there would be less housing production in the earlier part and more towards the end. So I think you should make sure that you will emphasize both the quantity as well as the quality of housing. Now I would like to turn to the aging of our buildings. Everybody has been working hard. The administration has come up with the policies to help us to mitigate the problem. And it is hoped that assistance can be given who are in need for repair and maintenance. Now for the aging of our buildings, I want to check how we can make sure that the design of our buildings is such that it is elderly friendly and it is of a universal design. It seems the government hasn't done enough. Recently, I visited some demonstration flats, and my idea was sort of implemented. That is, you should give early attention at the design stage. Now, perhaps you need to increase the cost as a result of the choice of materials. For one-person, two-person households, it will only take $50,000 to make it elderly friendly or have a design that is universal. Now, for the private sector, for the domestic flats, you emphasize that there is a need for a universal design, but then it may not actually be adequate to deal with the needs of the elderly people. Now, you want to age in place, you don't want to have to make a lot of conversions and alterations and still be able to live in the same flat, which is elderly friendly. So I just wondered if the Secretary would try to drive home the message among your departments, that is whether this can be done in the private sector. Otherwise, it would be too late and too costly if you only deal with it afterwards. So are you going to address this point? Secretary, I would like to thank the member for being so understanding. Indeed, the workload is heavy, but we will still do our utmost. Now, for the design, let me first of all deal with public housing. Many more units are to be produced by the Housing Authority. Now, as Mr. Tony Che has said, they do adopt a universal design. But then if there are other better options or suggestions, I know the Housing Authority and the Housing Society do have a very close dialogue. And even in the private sector, we have been working on this matter. I would like to defer to our Permanent Secretary. Well, Ms. Lin, well, for the private sector, we have been talking to the private sector. We do have concessions for floor areas. If the private sector is willing to introduce elderly-friendly features, and then we can give them a higher score. We have started our dialogue with the sector. We hope that we can expedite our work in this regard. And under the Development Bureau, we have the Land Development Advisory Committee. In fact, in due course, when the Buildings Department has got some preliminary ideas, that advisory body should be briefed and they will have a discussion. Well, I really hope that everything can be expedited, and I do look forward to having some outcome. Well, if you work hard but you don't achieve anything, it is not going to help. I think it is not just a matter of social responsibility. I think it also makes business sense. So I hope there will be a balance. Well, I really look forward to getting some results in the near future. I'm sure the Bureau has heard your suggestion. Next, 4 minutes, Mrs. Regina Yim. Thank you, Chair. As many members have said, for this Northern Metropolis Development Strategy, it is a very ambitious plan. It is going to change the outlook of the northern part of Hong Kong. In the long term, it is going to bring about a lot of development opportunities. In paragraph 30 of our policy address, it is said that 2.5 million people can be housed there, and then job opportunities will be raised drastically to 600,000. But it will take 20 years. Everybody is asking the administration to do it more quickly. It's of a mega scale, and so many projects are involved. Can you not, while launching the Northern Metropolis, attend to the Lantau Tomorrow vision? If you are going to have so much going on at the same time, then the construction companies will be working at their capacity both in the public and the private sector. There are bound to be omissions, negligence, like in the case of the Sha Tin Central Link. The expert said that probably the MTRCL was overramped. So if you're going to do both at the same time, please be frank, Secretary. Do you think that you can cope with it? Don't be bureaucratic. Thank you, Mrs. Yip, for your question. Well, if you look at 2030 plus, 10 years ago, of course, we talked about 2 strategic growth areas. Back then, we already said that there should be the Eastern Lantau Metropolis involving 1,000 hectares of land, and then the anti-north development. So for the Northern Metropolis, if you look at the total area, well, we are only talking about an addition of 600 hectares of land. For the rest, in fact, it involves area already covered by current or planned studies. But we have a breakthrough in our mindset. We are going to change the spatial distribution instead of just focusing on the southern part of Hong Kong. Now for reclamation, 1,000 hectares of land to come out from the artificial islands. If you look at the other reclamation projects, the total will be 1,260. Now we've just completed the reclamation for the 3-runway system. Currently, we're dealing with 800 hectares of reclamation. In terms of quality, in terms of cost, we're able to cope with it. We are grateful to the 3RS. Many people are concerned about the supply of sand. Now, mechanical sand has become a very good source of materials. With a steady source and with a reasonable cost, it is good. For public works, if you look at the budget, as I have said, we are spending $100 billion in our public works projects. We have $120 billion a year. In other words, we are able to spend $1.2 trillion on public works projects. We have the financial position, and our sector has the capacity. We are able to deal with that amount of works. We talk about manpower training, MIC, DFMA, and other innovative technologies. All of them will be taken up by us, and we're working very hard. No, I don't think he has answered my questions. Are you going to support importation of foreign labor? Well, what happens is that we should secure the interests of our local labor. Well, in the past, there were cases of importation of foreign labor. Recently, we have also got it, but not of a large scale. Now, when we have supplementary importation of labor, workers were able to go around different projects. But currently, for the construction industry, the unemployment rate is 6% or so. So we don't really have a very strong need for imported labor for construction. MIC isn't going to help, because planning is to be blamed for the slow pace of housing supply. If you haven't got land, you can't do anything. It takes 4, 5, 7 years to rezone a site. MIC would only save a few months' time. It doesn't help. Now, if you look at the map of Hong Kong, we want to develop the northern part of Hong Kong as well as the southern part of Hong Kong at the same time. So we are going to have a lot of economic activities in the north and in the south. But what about in the middle? We have the container terminal terminal. We do need one. But then when compared with our neighboring cities, our container terminal is getting more and more outdated in terms of the facilities, the location, etc. If you tell Kwai Chung and Tsuen Wan residents that you still want to have that number of container trucks plying between different destinations, they are not convinced. For Singapore, they have already relocated their terminal. Usually governments would relocate their terminals to newer areas. I think we should reclaim land for a new terminal. The government is not willing to carry out an in-depth study. Why is it so? Now, for Tsuen Wan and Kwai Chung residents, they have to put up with the container terminal for a long time. Well, there is air pollution as a result of the berthing of the container ships. So if we can relocate the container terminal to an appropriate site, then it means that we don't need that many brownfield sites to stack the containers. And then with appropriate use of logistics land, then this move will benefit our logistics industry. So I think the government should consider relocating the container terminal. At the same time, as Mr. Wilson Orr has said, we are talking about 400 hectares of land, which is a huge site, right in the middle of the territory. Why won't you consider it?
Secretary, and thank you, Chairman, and Mr. Ben Chan's question. For MIC, the Hong Kong U had the study that MIC is proven to reduce the time by 30%. Let's see, for 3 years, construction time can be shortened to 2 years. I agree with Mr. Chan said. That said, I'm working closely with Secretary Frank Chan for planning for turning land to spade ready and having them ready for construction. For the container terminal, the THB is the leading bureau. Secretary Chan already discussed it. Even though the throughput has dropped and the peak season, there's still a huge demand for the terminal. Currently, there are no plans to relocate. For long-term land use, an earlier way had come to secure the funding for the study of the Karicha Artificial Island, 1,000 hectares. While for the Cheung Chau South, I mentioned that it could serve as a relocation of the terminal. Well, we hopefully we can collect some data on the water depth and so on for future consideration. Well, for the long or short, medium-term land options in the 2030 plus, the terminal is not one of the options. We're looking at the overall layout of Hong Kong. We do need a huge area in the middle. Well, there'll be reclamation in other areas. Why can't the container terminals be relocated there? Will the government consider relocating the terminals to these newly reclaimed lands? The river trade terminal is not appropriate. Well, it is really for our river boats. Let's say for Long Kou Chan to Tuen Mun West, the water depth is not deep enough. It's really for main river channels. So now that the Tuen Mun West may be a possible solution. Well, Cheung Chau South has enjoyed a better water depth. However, this is a long-term consideration, and we will collect more data from the essential water study. For the Long Kou Chan, the water depth is about 12 meters, and for Kwai Chung currently it's about 14 meters. It's just 2 meters difference. For the Kwai Chung terminal, we frequently conducted dredging. So, well, as for Kwai Chung, it's not really deep, but it's still a contained terminal. Why not the Tuen Mun river terminal area? I urge the government can reconsider. I suppose Secretary heard Mr. Chan's opinion. Next, Mr. Holden Chow, 4 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. Well, the focus of the policy address is the Northern Metropolis. In my response to the address, I noticed that the perimeter of the metropolis is huge. However, it did not incorporate North West Tuen Mun. Well, for the planning perspective, I wonder you can preserve some flexibility in providing some infrastructure for the Tuen Mun residents' employment needs. One possible option, Secretary, as raised on another occasion, while there are a lot of land to provide for local IT industries, and I've been advocating reindustrialization, and the city adopted this policy of reindustrialization. Let's say by 2023, there will be the first advanced manufacturing center in Cheng Kwan O, and the government mentioned they will build another AMC. I hope the Bureau can consider for their second AMC, you can talk to the ITB that whether it could be located in Tuen Mun or Hung Shui Kiu. Well, we do have the geographic advantage. It is connected to the Shenzhen Bay port, and after we launch the rail between Hung Shui Kiu to Shanghai, it will just a 10-minute car journey apart. If we can put the AMC in Tuen Mun, we can provide local employment, which I hope they can take it to the ITB. Second, for the Northern Metropolis, you mentioned you will provide 650,000 jobs, 150,000 of those are IT related. Can the Secretary assess or provide a timetable of these jobs being provided? When we try to explain the policy address, the residents know that this grand, ambitious plan. Well, what matters to them is that they no longer need to travel long distance to work in Kowloon or Hong Kong Island. If we want to promote local employment, they're all interested in know when these jobs will be coming. Besides the IT jobs, which may be high-paying and put more effort to attract, while there will be also grassroots employment opportunities. Did the Bureau perform any estimate that when and what kind of jobs we provided, especially for grassroots positions? I see this is very important. I wonder can the Bureau can at least give us some pointers. Third point, for the river trade terminal, what the usage have been criticized as very low at just about 20%. While they're wasting it as a terminal, do we have other options for other users, let's say for IT or other commercial purposes in order to promote local employment? So 3 questions here. Thank you, Chairman. Secretary. Thank you, Chair and Mr. Chan. Okay, I will offer consolidated response. We're looking at the medium and long-term land supply option. Well, there are quite a few in Tuen Mun. Long Ku Tan 220 hectares and Tuen Mun West, including the river trade terminal. Well, they all together be 220, but not just reclamation. For Tuen Mun East, 70. Altogether, 510 hectares. I would see this is quite substantial and can provide opportunities for living and working. Speaking of IT, for the Northern Metropolis strategy, at the Lao Fo Shan Hung Shui Kiu, 5 hectares will be reserved for IT. And for the timeline for when the jobs are coming, well, based on the gross floor area to be provided, and then you translate it into job numbers, well, probably not practical to provide a year-on-year breakdown. And 3 more members would like to have a second round. Any more members would like to speak? Please press the button now. If not, that we can conclude the meeting as scheduled on 12:15. Otherwise, we need extension. So far, I don't see the need. Next, Mr. Edward Lau, second round. Deputy Chairman. Well, just now we talked about expediting the Northern Metropolis strategy. Well, the government may take the lead by relocating the government departments in the northern metropolis to spur development. Well, the developer, the lands department, and the plans department are the right ones to be relocated there. So for your borough, will your borough and the departments move to the northern metropolis? First question. Second question. Well, there's a lot of work to be done for the northern metropolis. In terms of planning and lands department, I see there's a manpower shortage. Even before the northern metropolis, there are quite a few NDAs in full swing. Can the secretary assess whether you have enough staff to cope with the northern metropolis program, or whether you need some changes to your staffing within your structure? Let's say for the North or South Development Office, and also involving different departments under your borough. Or maybe we do need to set up an NT North office in the future. Well, before you have this reorganization, whether you can do some reorganization internally to carry out the work more efficiently. Secretary, thank you, Mr. Lau's question. For the relocation of the government departments into northern metropolis, well, like the CE said, this definitely will happen. Well, the government property agency will monitor which department will move first. Well, as we finalize the details that it will be made public, will definitely be departments moving to this area. In terms of manpower, not just the lands department, we do need to work harder. Well, our current budget is not exactly generous. While we not anticipate there will be a massive increase in staffing establishment, we shall rely more on technology. While the lands team been using drones and also be using the electronic PDA for frontline enforcement, which will allow to capture the history and the images for expediting prosecutions. On Para 31, we will step up the enforcement mechanism, and well, the government will announce its position later. In terms of work division, there are designated staff overseeing these initiatives. Any follow-up? No. Now is my second round. Well, allow me to respond to the Secretary's answer. As for the securing 350 hectares, 80 of which are handed over to the THB for construction, this is indeed happening. And because of this, 250 hectares will be provided in the next 5 years. Well, they'll be handed over from 2022 to 23. Well, the first 5 years of the 10-year plan, we're currently meeting 1/3 of the target. The other 2/3 will be fulfilled in the second part of the 10-year plan. So that's why that the queuing time for public housing cannot be reduced in the short term. And different members have wished that you can expedite the land development process. Now my question. The Northern Metropolis strategy, besides solving the housing shortage, is also key to provide land for different types of economic activities, the focus being IT and modern logistics. Since the Development Bureau is the lead bureau, so how we should go about on the planning. The population planning is important. Well, So how many of the residents will be public housing tenants and how many would live in private housing, so as to prevent long distance commuting. So there will be a variety of jobs suiting different demographics. That's why we do need a population policy. I suppose I will not ask this question today as you're not able to answer. I suppose that population policy will sit front and center for future policy considerations. For the public-private housing mix with 70 and 30 mix, well, from 50-50 to 60-40, and now is 70-30. Can we adopt this ratio for the NT North? I believe this must be adjusted. Especially some of the district will have a concentrated IT activity. As you anticipate, you attract a lot of middle-class IT talent there, and therefore the 70-30 mix may not hold. Well, this is my view, and also hope the Secretary can respond. And also believe that this will be a key consideration going forward. Well, in 2018, well, the public-private housing split will now swap it to 70-30. We do not plan to change that. And this is also our position on the Northern Metropolis.
For the accommodation of the INT talents, well, there will be some at Ma Liu Shui, and then I think we have said that there would be special, dedicated housing for R&T talents where the enterprises are located. Well, I think for public housing, there's a very strong demand for that. So for the 70-30 split, I don't think even with more land available, we are able to change the mix. I'm not going to have an argument with you over this matter. Now, we are going to house 2.5 million people in the Northern Metropolis. You don't expect everybody moving from West Kowloon, East Kowloon to live in Northern Metropolis. So how much land will be used to attract people from outside of Hong Kong to go there? So I don't think you need to be rigid about the 70-30 mix. It is not an urgent issue. It is about the long term. But I would like to have it put on record. That is, the administration must think thoroughly about this demographic arrangement. Ms. Alice Mack. Ms. Mack is speaking for the first time, so she should be given the floor first, and then Mr. Chen is going to be the second. I think if we need to extend the meeting a little bit, I don't think we need to go all the way to 12:30, probably overrunning a little bit. Ms. Mack, in the policy address, it is said that we need to have the infrastructure first before moving people to the newly developed area. But I'm not quite sure how this is going to work in relation to the Northern Metropolis as well as the artificial islands. If we don't have the infrastructure ready, it will be impossible to see the two strategies work. For the Northern Metropolis, we have to wait for 20 years. I was engaged in another meeting just now. I'm sorry, I don't know if anybody has asked this question. Is there a chance to cut short the construction phase, whether we can expedite the project so that both the Northern Metropolis as well as the Land Town Tomorrow Vision can be commissioned as early as possible so as to boost the housing supply? I think in the policy address, mention has been made about streamlining the development process. There may be a need to revise and amend the laws. I think the Development Bureau is already working on it. Is it possible for you to vouch anything? And then for my private member's bill, that is amending the protection of harbour ordinance. The policy address also refers to the review of that ordinance. What is the progress? Secretary. I'd like to thank Ms. Mack for her questions. Yes, we do agree that we need to have the infrastructure in place first. This will apply in the case of the artificial islands. It is not that in 20 years' time, all out of a sudden, we have that amount of land ready. In fact, it is going to be an evolving process. You may be concerned about innovation technology. It will provide a lot of job opportunities. 87 hectares of land will be available at the river loop. There will be sway-ready sites available. By 2025, we'll be able to deliver. In other words, in the next 4 years, all the land will be formed to become sway-ready. Well, we are going to have another 70 hectares of land to be added under the Northern Metropolis. We're supposed to have another 80, and by 2030, we'll be able to deliver that as well. Between 2032 to 2033, we are going to have 200,000 more people. And then if we discount the 600 to be added, 40% already is committed. I agree with Ms. Mack, that is, we should work even harder and faster. As to the development control measures, I would like to defer to the Permanent Secretary. Yes, Permanent Secretary. Thank you, Chair. We have already pledged that as soon as the new term of the LegCo assumes office, we will come back to brief you on the measures. But in recent weeks, we have already given you some ideas. Let me give 2 other examples. We would like to work in tandem in relation to different procedures. Say, for example, once we are ready with a study on reclamation, we wonder if we can start reclamation while we try to go through the town planning process and consider the land users. So we are going to study this matter. We'll make it clear in our legislation to avoid being taken to court for judicial reviews. In this regard, we need the LegCo's support. Another point is that in future, say for example, once a plan has been amended, but we have yet to come here to get funding to carry out detailed studies, can we not start the land resumption process and start the negotiation? It used to be sensitive because the LegCo hasn't granted the funding. We should not start the land resumption. But then I think we should consider having them being done in parallel. Of course, we have to strike a balance. In recent days, we have mooted the ideas. We want to kickstart the discussion, but then the details will be available next year when we come back here. What about protection of harbor ordinance? Someone asked this question a moment ago. Secretary, yes, I know Ms. Mack is concerned about that. Yes, it was mentioned in the policy address. We won't object to a review study. We'll see how we can start a discussion. When I'm talking about a large-scale public consultation, we're wondering if there are elements that we can consider revising them. Now, the administration doesn't think that we need to have reclamation in the Victoria Harbour for land disposal. In the future, we are mainly talking about creating more open space and enhancing our connectivity. So we are having 2 projects in mind. One from the former runway to Kuntong. So we do think that there is room for some fine-tuning. Mr. Junus Ho, first round, 4 minutes. I agree with what the Permanent Secretary has said. That is, we try to see if we can remove the landmines and deregulate the control measures for you. In the first quarter next year, when we have the first term of the new term of the LegCo, there will be possible amendments to the town planning ordinance. In fact, I have identified 4 pieces of legislation. First of all, the town planning ordinance. For the town planning powers, I think the Chief Executive in Council, in accordance with Section 19A, may alter any plan, but then we can delete what follows in Section 17.4 and say that as long as the C in Council has got any recommendations on any zonal plans, then that should be final. This is my proposal. You can also relax the requirements. Currently, under Section 19A, there is a lot of cross-referencing. You need to streamline that. And then another piece of legislation is the IAO. It is said that it will apply to the Hong Kong government. I think we need to add a qualifier there to say that unless the C in Council says otherwise, that is, otherwise the government should be bound. But then if the C in Council makes a change, then it will enjoy overriding power. And then for the New Territories Ordinance, last week we had an oral question. We tried to see how much money was locked up in relation to the compensation process. $1.4 billion were involved. That's our idea. I think sometimes it's all because of the absence of Chow Tong managers, but it seems the government hasn't got the data. I know that 3 months after issuing notice, if nobody claims the compensation, then the money will go back to the government. So our impression is that you act very quickly when you resume land, but because of missing title, missing grant, missing this and that, then you will be slow in dispersing the compensation. So the Development Bureau should look at that. And then for the Land Resumption Ordinance, I think there is a Section 12 and Section 4, subsection 5, says that if there is compensation, we should take into account the zonal values. It says that when it comes to land resumption, certain procedures have to be followed. So for town planning for ordinance, section 4, subsection 4, you should simply take out subsection 4. For land resumption ordinance, section 12C and section 12A as to how the amount of compensation would be calculated for the owners. Again, please improve upon that. Otherwise, it will be difficult to tell whether we should compensate according to the zone that is residential or housing. In fact, I think according to my interpretation of the laws, there should be compensation instead of no compensation as it currently is. For those 4 items of legislation, if you act swiftly in the first quarter, I think for you to resume land and to deal with the voices objection, it will help significantly. I just want to make a statement. Secretary, a brief reply, please. I'm grateful to Mr. Ho, Dr. Ho, for his comments. I would look forward to something in writing for our detailed consideration. For the town planning ordinance as well as the land resumption ordinance, we do hope that in Q1 we can come up with some concrete proposals. For the NTO, well, the district of, the HAD and the Hung Guk have come up with the setting up of a working group. They may not be ready in the first quarter, but I'm sure your points can be referred to Mr. Casper Choi, the SHA, for his consideration. Finally, Mr. Ben Chen, 3 minutes. Tsuen Wan is celebrating its 60th anniversary as a new town. In other words, there are many buildings in Tsuen Wan that are approaching an age of 60 years. Now, for Tsuen Wan's redevelopment, yes, there will be a plan. It is a piece of good news. People have been waiting for redevelopment in Tsuen Wan. It is said that there will be an overall plan for the redevelopment of Tsuen Wan. It is a good move. Don't try to be piecemeal in the land resumption. It's better to have an overall layout plan. And then for the administration, for Yaomate and Mongkok, the URA was tasked with the job to look at the redevelopment proposals. It took them 3 to 4 years' time. For Yaomate and Mongkok, it covers a larger area than Chunwan. So my question is, when will the URA plan to carry this out, and do you have a timetable? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chan. I would like to thank Mr. Ben Chan for raising the issue of Chunwan redevelopment on numerous occasions, whether in public or in private. Well, this time we shall look at the Chunwan redevelopment. Well, the Chunwan plot ratio is currently 5. Well, now that we count it as an urban area and a lot of the transport infrastructure, we wonder if we can raise the plot ratio. The time will be much less than Yaomate and Mongkok, as it's much smaller. We'll now invite URA to undertake study on the Samshuipo and Chunwan. Both will start soon and will wrap within 2 years. If everything goes well, it will be complete by 2023. Well, that's quite good news to me. Well, 2 years for planning and start redevelopment or renewal, and hopefully within the next decade there will be a brand new community. For the Chunwan and the new territories, there are lots of areas with low plot ratios. Would the government consider lifting the plot ratios in certain parts of NT, or allow a plot ratio transfer in order to encourage renewal, as there are pockets of Chunwan and Kwai Chung is quite old. For example, in Shek Lei and Shek Yam, there are quite a lot of dilapidated areas. I hope that the government can start considering urban renewal in these urban pockets. Well, for a succinct reply, well, suppose we need to assign priority for different renewal plans. For some Samshuipo Chunwan, hopefully we can start some district-based studies. For individual projects, especially for public housing, for specific land parcels, subject to passage by the TPB, we allow a 30% increase of the maximum permissible plot ratio. Well, this applies for rezoning for the suitable land parcels. I suppose it's much better if we can lift the plot ratio for the entire area. Now that all the members have their turn, and second item, any other business. This meeting is the last panel meeting within this term of LegCo. I would like to thank our members and the administration, and mainly the Development Bureau and the departments for actively partaking in the work of the panel. Well, we managed to take care of a lot of short, medium, and long-term development items. As the chairman of this panel, I feel that it's been very rewarding in presiding over the meetings. We noticed that how the legislature and the executive branches of the government managed to positively interact with each other, and I wish everyone good health and success for all your future work, and continue to benefit the public. Thank you. So nothing under AOB. The meeting adjourned. Thank you.